welcome to the Armenian Studies lecture series, the third lecture by Dr. Simon Maghakyan. Before I introduce him, I want to remind you that we have one more talk next Thursday here in this room, so it's one of the most interesting talks. I mean, all the talks are very interesting. I personally am very much interested in Armenian khachkars, and so if you're interested in that, we have Maghakyan coming to present his new book and talking about the crossstones, the Armenian crossstones, the Armenian khachkars. So that's next Thursday, not Friday. It is my great pleasure to present Dr. Simon Maghakyan here today. Dr. Simon Maghakyan and I met on Twitter many years ago, and it was a wonderful meeting because I discovered his profound research and extremely important research into the cultural heritage, the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage in Maghakyan. Dr. Maghakyan has published extensively on this topic, and very soon his dissertation will be published with the Cambridge University Press, entitled Sovereign Heritage Crime, Security, Autocracy, and the Material Past. And I just want to say that his work has featured in different very well-known media, such as Forbes and BBC and CNN. He's given many evaluations of what was happening in Nagorno-Karabakh during the war and afterwards. And I think just the two words that have been used by these media outlets to describe his research tell us everything about his work. So one of them, called The Guardian, called his research as rock solid, and the other one was groundbreaking, and it is indeed, because in his research he has been using a variety of methods, starting from just reading the primary sources and also satellite imagery. And I would highly recommend you to read his one of his first works on the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage in Maghakyan, which was initially published in the Hyperallergy, and then The Guardian had a featured article on this. He did this work with Sarah Pickman, and it is one of the important pieces of research on that topic. Without any I have to mention that also Dr. Maghakyan is the 20th Kazan visiting professor at Fresno University. Unfortunately, this is his last lecture this semester, but we hope to welcome him again in the near future. The floor is yours.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. Today's final lecture is called The Future of the Past, Pathways for Saving Armenian Vestiges in Turkey. This photograph is of a tour shop booth at Van on the island of Ahtamar in Turkey, where local Kurdish vendors, because of interactions with Armenian tourists and Armenian pilgrims, have learned how to spell correctly Ahtamar, unlike the Turkified version of Ahtamar. It is a subtle and minor difference to outsiders, but for Armenians who have seen their history denied, dismissed, and erased in Turkey, it is a big deal. Ahtamar was built in year 915, exactly 1,000 years before the Armenian genocide. One of the most important Armenian cathedrals. It's named Surp Khach, Holy Cross. The interior is out of this world, and it survived in 1951 an ongoing destruction thanks to the Kurdish author Yashar Kemal, whom we have mentioned previously. Armenian pilgrims today are able to visit the cathedral because of President Erdogan, the leader of Turkey's earlier years, when he was trying to be more of a democrat, more inclusive than he has become in recent years. But this has allowed Armenians to have impact. And this has opened a door to pathways for rethinking the erasure that's happening in Turkey and avoiding the alternative of seeing entire landscapes like the city of erased from the face of the earth. Now, let's start with reviewing the data of what we know and how we know of the Armenian heritage in Turkey. Maghakyan is one of the sources that has documented the historical landscape throughout the different processes of the Ottoman Empire, from which nearly the entire Armenian population was violently removed during and after the Armenian genocide. As we have discussed before, Maghakyan collected the data of churches, recounted 2,000 of them, although that at the time excluded the region of Kaz, which was part of Eastern Armenia. But research on Armenian architecture, which is based in Yerevan, has done incredible work documenting and continues to do work documenting the Armenian heritage of the region. A very important workshop took place in 2013, organized by World Monuments Fund, called ANI in Context, where they were able to have an assessment of existing sites in the Kars region, but as you can tell, it's only of the high churches, the more better known ones. A much more detailed base by the Hrant Dink Foundation that's available online documents many of the churches that have existed throughout the Ottoman Empire. And in 2012, they created this 400-page declaration, and I'll tell you why they call it so, that documents hundreds and hundreds of sites throughout Istanbul alone that belong to Armenian foundations, and that was stated until after 1936. We're not talking about private properties, we're talking about foundation church properties, whether it's religious buildings or even apartment complexes, etc., etc. And you have just 2 pages out of the 20 pages in that book that's documenting the losses that the Armenian foundations have occurred in Istanbul alone. We also have a recent study by USERF, which is the U.S. Congressional Commission on International Religious Freedom, that looked at threats to heritage sites, active religious sites in Turkey. And Armenians are disproportionately targeted till this day in the Republic of Turkey. Which brings us to the question of what happens to heritage in conflict and how we can find pathways for saving whatever still survives. But it's important to put this conversation in context with other conflicts across the world, including in the 1990s in Mostar during the Balkans War, that there was destruction of this famous bridge. You may remember the scene for 2001 when the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. You may recall the destruction of Jufa or Juva, the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery in Nakhchivan in 2005. The destruction of shrines at Timbuktu, Mali in 2012. Destruction or attempted destruction of Palmyra by ISIS in 2015. Destruction that is still of Uyghur or Uyghur Islamic heritage in China, which we don't have videos or photographs of, but there are plenty of satellite images showing the disappearance or alteration of thousands and thousands of mosques. Of course, we also recall the dual strikes against Shushi's Kazan Cathedral during the 2020 war, and also images of Azerbaijani soldiers vandalizing Armenian churches and cemeteries, and the ongoing destruction documented by Caucasus Heritage Watch and other light imagery, including that of Ganajam, the solar church of Shushi. So what happens to heritage during and after conflict? And conflict can be thought of in political science as active conflict or a passive conflict, but all of the examples that I mentioned were done in relation to some sort of a security arrangement or some conflict. So there are 3 policies that I have identified. I'm still working on this topic in conflicts in regards to managing the otherized heritage, the heritage of whether it's the minority group or the group that's seen as the other. So the first would be negation or negationism, and that terminology borrowed from scholarship on basically erasure of minoritized communities. And that can take several forms, whether it's state organized or state sanctioned, but also hand in hand with exclusionary narratives and denialist discourse. And students from my class, that I teach Armenian Heritage and Conflict class, will notice that I'm borrowing terminology from Laura Jane Smith in terms of authorized discourse. Here are some examples of negation. I also saw other examples during earlier lectures. The 7th century Surpovane St. John the Baptist Cathedral or Church of Bhagavan, which is completely missing. Interestingly enough, its epic heritage, the inscriptions were documented earlier in the century. We even know the name of the architect, which is very unusual for a building of that. And as research on Armenian architecture has documented, it's completely missing today. We have also seen images earlier of the Holy See of Cilicia or Cilicia, the Catholic state in Sis, which is also nearly completely gone. Similar images from Khatskong, close to today's Armenian border, only one church remaining. So those are examples of negation. So this is one scenario that can continue in Turkey. Now, part of negationists can be sovereign heritage crime or state-sponsored destruction of minoritized heritage by proxy, meaning the work can be done by non-state actors, and this is particularly true in Turkey today, as many of you have seen in The Economist just 2 months ago. There was a very detailed article about the industrial looting of Armenian sites that's happening right now. One of the men behind this looting process is Uğur Kılıç, who has sold, according to him, several million metal detectors throughout Turkey, which is his business. He has hundreds of videos with hundreds of thousands of views training how to loot Armenian property. Here in this video, he's showing how to, in his thinking, ethically excavate or loot a church so that you're not threatening the foundation. It's a pseudoscience of fantastic proportions. They have come up with their own terminology. Crosses are signs for hidden treasure, etc., etc. And there are some interesting scholarship that I'll reference later on just to understand this process. Now, if you want to look up this information on your own, just use detector. In just the Istanbul area, you will see dozens of shops up that all they do is sell metal detectors for treasure hunting. And there are some images from the ground of the enormous put into this to dig holes and for treasure. Now, negation sometimes can be done through less violent ways by the state. And here's an example that may feel a little counterintuitive. This is Hulavan, two images from the looting that has happened. But the counterintuitive example, a site that's relatively well preserved, and it has some connection to Armenians, but not exclusively Armenian. It's the mausoleum on Mount Nemrut, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, where there are Hellenistic, Greco-Hellenistic gods that pagan Armenians also worship, built by Antiochus Theos, who considered himself Armenian, perhaps more for political reasons than for other reasons, because this was the time of Tigranes the Great, the greatest Armenian king. And he borrowed the famous Armenian tiara of Armenian ruling family at the time. And when you read literature in Turkey that's described the site, they're not using the term Armenian tiara, they're calling it the 5-pict or 5-something tiara but to erase the Armenian connection. Something not controversial otherwise, but something that Turkey chooses to erase. So there are different examples of how history can be created. This one is not permanent erasure, obviously. It's something that will be self-corrected, just as Armenian pilgrims were able to self-correct the spelling of Akhtamar. Now, the next scenario, or the next policy in ethno-territorial conflict in terms of managing heritage is neglection or neglect. And there are several types of neglect. There is malign neglect, that is neglected on purpose with a very predictable outcome. There is passive neglect, and there is active neglect. And there's, of course, dismissive discourse where you're not denying or erasing someone's heritage, but you're just not prioritizing. Now, the examples of that are not as crystal clear, and some of those categories are not crystal clear. But a visual image of that could arguably be from Surkhajim Akhtamar itself, where a church has been allowed to be erased, yet survived, which allowed for renovation later on. The third and the preferable range of policies or scenarios in ethno-territorial conflict is what we might call negotiation, which also can take several forms. It could be appropriation, and that includes conversion. It can be seen as the target group as symbolic violence, but from perspective of physical preservation is preferred over negation. It can maybe be just tolerance for the existence or embrace. And ideally, return, and I have return, not necessarily returning a property to the community in a legal manner, but maybe allowing the community to return to the sacred site. So it takes many, many forms, and we're going to talk about those in detail. But one example we have is appropriation. Here is an example of a khachkar that's disrespected but somehow still survives and has been made into a makeshift fountain. Another example of appropriation, yet still one that allows for physical survival, is not only the conversion of the Cathedral of Kars into a mosque, but its inclusion in sort of plexi ads throughout the city. But in an interesting way, if you notice, it's actually a picture of the church before the conversion that's featured through Kars. And when you speak to locals about things and how Armenians might feel about it, some of them push back and argue that this is the very limited ways in which they can talk about the past in open ways. So to summarize the three policies, we have three scenarios in Turkey and in every ethno-territorial conflict regarding the possible future of. Of course, negation is the ultimate erasure, often completely physical and sometimes not so physical. Neglect is the second option that sometimes allows for preservation in the future, but other times, if the neglected materials are smaller scars, they will be destroyed if there is not much protection. And of course, the negotiation, and there might be better terms, so those are still terms that need some vetting. And negotiation is the preferred scenario where somehow the authorized discourse by a state allows for embracing a previously minoritized and otherized culture. Now, in the classroom, we learn with the students about civic engagement, and that is how stakeholders or how people concerned about an issue can make a difference. And in that process, we try to identify power, we call them stakeholders who we can appeal to and ask for help, whether you want something done in your community or nationally. You look for someone who has both high impact and high interest. That is the ideal place. Well, Armenians are the most important stakeholders of their heritage in Turkey, like every community would be of the heritage that they consider sacred. So they have very, very high interest, but we know that Armenians don't have very high impact. Although, as some examples we'll discuss will show, that might be changing. So then the question becomes, how do we increase stakeholder influence? How do we build agency for those who have high interest but have low impact? And there are examples, one of which we talk about. And that is that Armenian pilgrimages to Turkey, especially to Akhtamar, have allowed for this very interesting transformation. Now, the transformation might not be as welcome because, interestingly enough, it's not transforming it back to the roots. And I'll tell you what I mean. When you speak to the shop owners in this region, they speak Armenian. They can count in Armenian, but it's not in Western Armenian. It's in Eastern Armenian, because many of the pilgrims back are from the Republic of Armenia. So they're not learning the indigenous language of the land, which would be Western Armenian, right, with slightly different pronunciation, but they're learning the Armenian spoken in the Republic of Armenia. So very interesting. I don't know how many of you have been and have had this experience, but I was shocked to see Kurdish shop owners speak Eastern Armenian in Van. Not too far away from there is Varakavang, which was a major sacred site, and we spoke about it on our first lecture. And today, only small parts of it remain. And that is in part thanks to Armenian tour directors from Armenia who keep bringing groups to this very small village in the valley, able to look after the church, have a door and a lock so that it's not used for looting or by cattle. And this is a photo that I took 10 years ago, so I'm not sure what how the family has changed since, but I would assume that it is still the same family in Varagavang that has made this connection with Armenian tour directors. A much more interesting example is from Diyarbakir, historically referred to as Igranaker, and this is a picture of Sur Giragos before a renovation. It's a church not as old as Varagavang or Akhtamar, so it's by Armenian standards not that old, which is 500 years, if not more. And interestingly enough, it was renovated by the local Armenian community, which is very counterintuitive because most Armenians, including parts of my family, were either brutally massacred or expelled from the area. Very few families remained. They Islamized. They kept ties with relatives abroad, including in Canada and the U.S. They developed a relationship, and about 10 years ago, they were able to renovate the church with some support from the local Kurdish administrators in Giragos. Interestingly enough, this was 2014. 2 years later, there was conflict between the PKK, the Kurds, and the Turkish government, and the church was damaged and even confiscated against the Turkish government. Yet the community went back to both the local Kurdish administrators and also went back to the Turkish government and convinced them to renovate it. And so they were able to reopen it again this year. Now, this picture is from 2014. There was a documentary being made. At the time I was there, you've probably seen the documentary by Ani Hovanesyan, which was on PBS. Here she is interviewing an Islamized Armenian from Diyarbakir, who, because of the church, was able to find her roots, find a community, convert back to Christianity after several generations of things as occurred. And in this picture, you also have stakeholders. To the left, you have a pilgrim from the Republic of Armenia. She was part of the group that I was with. You have a researcher here, Steven Sim, who spent decades going back to Turkey to document the Armenian heritage. You have local Turks who are helping, a couple of whom thought I was a Turkish spy because I was seeing a photograph and I had not talked to Ani or Steve in person before that. So that was a very interesting encounter. But if you ever go to that part of the world, Gyagos has a beautiful courtyard that allows for the Armenian community to feel safe and to have agency. And that is something incredible in just the last 2 months, and we will talk about that a little bit. Now, so we looked at examples of how Armenians have had agency and have fought to build up influence despite the horrible conditions that this community existed. And now I want to bring the conversation a bit broader to the question of who owns the past, and that is to see our responsibility and also see the complex ways in well-meaning people are sometimes contributing to destruction. And what I'm referring to is something that I've done myself, and that's collecting coins. A lot of the churches and cemeteries that are being destroyed in Turkey, including through metal detector searches, the outcome are hoards of metal coins that are being found and placed online and sold on eBay, Vcoins, etc., and a lot of coin shows. And a lot of the collectors are Armenians who want to own their heritage, who want to feel connected to their heritage, say they, and I'm quoting a particular collector, they want the coins to end up in the right hands. Now, a lot of those coins, actually probably every single of these coins, so they have been found and they're being sold because of destruction that's happening and continues to happen. And this is an important conversation because there is Armenian associations, I think one of them might be inactive, that are engaged in coin collection, in the study of coins, which is very, very important because this is a very solid way of talking about Armenian history. Because there's nothing controversial about coins. Everyone in numismatics knows that that's the Armenian tiara. Even Turkish who have to list those, they have to use Armenian terminology. Oftentimes they'll put Tigran as the Great in quotation marks for obvious reasons. It's very interesting, and holding an ancient coin is like holding history, right? So there's a lot of fascination about owning a part of the past. And if you also notice, to be honest, it's rather affordable. I mean, some are extremely expensive. They can be thousands and thousands of dollars depending on quality, but some are worth, $20. A piece of history of the Crusader Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia or Kilikia, even some of Tigranes the Great's coins. You can see here's an example of how the Great is put in quotation marks and how some of his coins can be just about $50. But this is an important discussion that needs to take place because of the destruction that's happening today. According to that master looter whose picture I had up, he says that there are 4 million looters or treasure hunters in Turkey. That's an incredibly high number of people engaged in destruction on a daily basis. Interestingly enough, if you read the economies, they're not finding out much. So most of the time they don't find much, so there are interesting theories about the reasons why they're doing it. So it's not just economic reasons. Perhaps there are incentives for the Turkish government to keep especially young Kurdish men busy in doing something that also destroys Armenian heritage. There is a Turkish scholar who's about to release his dissertation from Johns Hopkins. He says that even though the Turkish government will not publicize Armenian property records, which is against the Turkish laws, you can actually, if you were able to get access to all the loot permits that the Turkish government has issued that would be, he calls, an alternative archive of the Armenian genocide. So yes, you heard it right. The Turkish government issued or treasure hunting permits to treasure hunt Armenian properties. Now, these are often private properties, so they're not necessarily churches, cemeteries, but enormous destruction that is happening. Now, I mentioned that it is relatively affordable, unless you start buying a lot of them, to own these coins. Armenian movable, tangible heritage pieces that are related to Western Armenians or Ottoman Armenians, and I want to mention two examples. One is being sold at a New York auction right now for $130,000 by a famous Armenian artist, Takis Diranyan, although I believe he was at the time, so this was not made in Western Armenia, but the painting was later on in Europe. For the same exact price, this is an interesting one, right now there is an Armenian church in the Urfa region in Turkey on sale. And this is on a real estate website in Turkey. You have to register to be able to access it unless you're in there. I have the website on the lower left corner. So it's about 4.4 million Turkish lira, which is about $128,000. And of course, if you're wondering, let's pitch in and buy it. Foreigners, especially Armenians, are not allowed to purchase properties in Turkey. But it's interesting to see the price comparison, but also keep in mind how coin collection is sort of fitting to this destruction. But let's come to the question of what happens next, which is the most important question because we need to be thinking of the future. So there are some opportunities, although those can also turn into challenges. One is the so-called normalization. All Armenian governments have tried to do with the Republic of Turkey. That includes the opening of the border. And I think during the Q&A last time, we talked a little bit about that, whether it would be beneficial or not. On average, it would be beneficial because it would allow for pilgrimages, but there's more specific opportunities that we will talk in just a couple of slides. Challenges, there are many more challenges, and it's not just in Armenian-Turkish relationships, but also within the Republic of Turkey. Giragos, as I mentioned, in Diyarbakir, Giragos was damaged during the 2016 conflict between local Kurds and the Turkish government, or the PKK and the Turkish government. There is a chance that Turkey may not choose to negotiate with the past. It may choose to do more the, if not the negation, but perhaps the malign neglect that has been happening. Natural causes are also an important factor to keep in mind for challenges. Last time we saw of Kurtuluş Mosque in Aintab or Gaziantep, which is the former Holy Mother of God Armenian Cathedral. The dome has entirely collapsed because of the earthquake in Turkey last year. And limited resources, and this is pointed out in Adam T. Smith's excellent article about archaeology in Turkey, that some of the destruction has also happened because of limited resources, and others have also noted that. And of course, a lot of people who study the ongoing looting or the treasure hunting, they see some economic factors in that as well. In terms of factors to consider, domestic factors, especially democratization, very, very important. The reason why Armenians have had an opportunity to reclaim Diyarbakir, it's because Kurds are very active there. They envision Diyarbakir as sort of a capital of an autonomous Kurdistan one day, and Kurds see Armenians as a way of showing that coexistence is possible, that there is a way for somehow to be an embrace of all the minorities. So there are a lot of internal politics, and it's important to be able to understand and use those politics for good reason. the normalization between Armenia and Turkey, if it were to happen, would probably on average be a good reason or a good incentive for more preservation. There are international organizations, I think last time during Q&A, we talked about the role of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization that's charged with protecting global heritage. UNESCO could play a positive role. There is a cited study by this organization from 1974 that looked at remaining Armenian churches in their state that should be updated. But most importantly, because we live in the United States, an important window of opportunity is the upcoming renegotiation for the U.S.-Turkey Memorandum of Understanding concerning the import of antiquities. So there's about a dozen or more, excuse me, there are about a dozen or more MOUs between the U.S. government and foreign countries that are sources of antiquities imports. The U.S. government commits to repatriating illegally or illicitly transported or exported antiquities, so coins, etc., and in return, there is an unpublicized commitment by the other country to do certain good things. And interestingly enough, no one, even people involved in those circles, no one knows what Turkey's commitments are. So it was actually signed in 2021, in the last month of the first Trump administration. And as far as I know, I've spoken to many different stakeholders. No Armenians have been consulted in this process. The MOUs are renegotiated every 5 years. So the next one, thanks so much. The next one is coming up in 2026, and the renegotiation process is about to start. And this is an opportunity for Armenian stakeholders, primarily institutional stakeholders, whether it's in the U.S., but it's primarily in Turkey, but also scholars to find a way to have a voice in this process. And of course, institutionally, the most important stakeholders be the Patriarchate in Istanbul and also the Holy See of Asia or Kilikya. So keep an eye on the U.S.-Turkish MOU, and if you're involved with any organizations that might be interested in this, I'll to look into this, because it's not something that the U.S. government is going to ask the community about. This is something that the community has to really fight for. Now, the needs are many, including a comprehensive assessment. Now, incredible work has been done and is being done by several organizations listed below, but a comprehensive assessment of all known sites, their state, their physical condition, and all the factors impacting their physical and political future has not been done. Because we're talking about hundreds of sites throughout an enormous geographic area that would require very considered resources. Documentation and a comprehensive assessment has to be done at some point. And of course, like with every effort, stakeholder coordination, or at least conversation among the important stakeholders so that the work is not being repeated and they can exchange information. If you're interested in learning more about efforts that are ongoing, both by institutions but also individuals, I've listed some resources to follow, including the Armenian Genocide Art Repatriation Project at UCLA, which is managed by Professor Taner Akçam. The Gomidas Institute in London, headed by Maghakyan, is doing incredible ongoing field work in Turkey. Research on Armenian Architecture, RAA, founded by Armen Afnazaryan and Samuel Karapetyan, and now led by Rafi Kortosyan in Yerevan and Joram Manucheryan based in California. The Hrant Dink Foundation in Istanbul is doing incredible work. I referenced the 2012 declaration, which is a play on words, because in 1936 the Turkish government asked Armenian and other minority foundations to give a list of properties. And in 1975, during conflict with Cyprus, Turkey made a law that everything that had not been declared in 1936 was no longer claimable by those foundations. So in 2012, the Hrant Foundation said, here is a declaration of all the properties in Istanbul alone that ideally should be returned, or hopefully will be returned to the Red Foundation. We're talking about community properties, not even personal properties. There's also a Hijat Association of architects and engineers in Istanbul, which is also very much involved in this process. There's Virtual Ani by Stephen Sim, and incredible work by so many scholars, but I wanted to point out Professors Hempa, Christina Maranti, Anush Tamar Suni, who are following the developments on the ground, so I would encourage looking up their work. Now, we only have just a few more slides left. I'll try to save some time for Q&A. But I want us to imagine sort of the best case scenario and what it might entail and what can happen for it. And so let's imagine heritage negotiation. It's not the ideal scenario. There's never going to be an ideal scenario, a post-genocide landscape that has been erased for so many decades, right? So this is a conversation about pursuing the possible, not pursuing any idealist scenario. But what is it that can be done today and tomorrow to save whatever remains of Turkey's past or Armenian past? And there are some interesting examples to follow. One is a 2017 agreement between the governments of Turkey and Georgia concerning several churches that Turkey considers Georgian, although historically they might be also related to Armenians of the region as well, who, you know, for political reasons chose a different sort of Orthodox affiliation. 3 Georgian churches and others in northeastern Turkey. Historically, those have been better preserved, not as much looting, and architecturally, they don't look any different than Armenian churches, right? So there is a indication right away that neglect has not been benign or passive, that there have been active, if not malign, neglect concerning Armenian churches. But just 2017, the Turkish and Georgian governments made an agreement restoring those churches, whether it's providing some physical stability so that there's no further collapse, excuse me, or if, you know, looking at some restoration projects. Very welcoming. Another welcoming development that I mentioned earlier as well is in a part of Turkey that Maghakyan has been following, areas that have been looted heavily and are on the verge of destruction. And because of local outreach, not on political ground, just talking about the sacredness and the importance of those sites for Armenians, have recently resulted in a hopeful first step of at least fencing up churches so that there's immediate looting or cattle going there. Not an ideal scenario, not a sort of a sustainable preservation, but an important, urgent step that needs to happen to all Armenian sacred sites throughout Turkey. Now, another thing that has already been announced is the so-called restoration of the famous bridge over to Akhuryan in Ani, the famous Baghdadi Armenian capital that was actually under Armenian control after World War I, but you know, Armenians end up losing the Kars region to Turkey, and this would connect the Armenian side to the Turkish side, and Armenian and Turkish governments are now discussing plans of restoration. Architecturally speaking, it has been criticized for doing more damage than help, but symbolically it's supposed to show that there is a way to repair, etc., etc. So architecturally, very controversial probably, there will be more destruction, so normalization does not always necessarily lead to good architectural outcomes. But at least some discussion between the two states of joint projects of rebuilding together. Now let's actually imagine something much more courageous that would not necessarily be done by states, but by state-approved architects and archaeologists. So we have archaeologists from Armenia who are able to go to Turkey and work with archaeologists in Turkey to look for something incredible. What could that be? Not necessarily a church. Perhaps the long-lost capital of Tigranes the Great, Tigran, which is associated with Diyarbakir, but a lot of scholars very convincingly point to a different location, including research on Armenian architecture. So they're not just non-Armenian scholars. There is a place called Arzan, which is not too far from Diyarbakir. You can see, yeah, it's still a distance though. And Arzan is considered by archaeologists perhaps the best candidate for the capital city of the Armenian Empire. It was only Armenia's capital for 20-some years, but still a very important part of Armenian history that is abandoned now. There's never been archaeological work done here, and there is some looting and construction that's happening. And the reason why I'm specifically thinking of this as heritage negotiation is because another site built by the same king was discovered in 2007 in Artsakh under Armenian control. Also, not the capital of the Armenian Empire, but an important regional center. Azerbaijan, of course, considers it a forgery and says there's no such a thing. But if Turkey and Armenia found a way to have a project that would look at the locally in Turkey, perhaps that could inspire Azerbaijan at some point to rethink some of its own policies concerning Armenian heritage. So we're not just imagining negotiation in Turkey, but also in the whole region. Now, another example, again, of the incredible Armenian community in Diyarbakir is the good news from earlier this year that the other church in Diyarbakir, the abandoned Armenian church, this is Sarkis, Saint Sarkis, will also be renovated. So just this summer, the Armenian locals are reopening Surkiagos. They convinced the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul. They convinced the Turkish Ministry of Culture, convinced the local administrators in Diyarbakir to come together and give some seed money for the restoration of the Second Armenian Church. And Aras Sarkisian just 2 months later on took a picture of that. So the restoration has already started. Just think about it. Armenians in an area where no Armenians are left, Islamized Armenians, reclaimed their roots. They renovated Kiragos. It was destroyed again. They renovated it again. Brought together people who don't want to be in the same room and convinced them to renovate. And so when I was in Kiragos, Surkiagos 10 years ago, there was a message there to all of us. And you can tell it's written in English, so it's primarily addressed to the Armenian diaspora. For donations, but sending a much more important message about agency, about responsibility. This restoration, it says, has been made possible with your donations. Each of our roots, living in this land for thousands of years. Do not forget it. So it's talking, I'll go back, you guys, I see you want to take a picture. So it's talking about not just rights, but about responsibilities. And I want to close by an example of 129 years ago, of something incredible that I briefly referenced before, not today, but during an early lecture. But I want to really try to understand this incredible thing that this community of Armenians in my ancestral hometown Urfa has done. This is the Saladin Ayubi Jami, so the Saladin Mosque, which was Surpas Pasatin Cathedral, so Holy Mother of God Cathedral. This is in the town of Urfa. In 1895, in December of 1895 during the Armenian massacres. 3,000 people who were taking refuge in there for safety were burned alive. It was called the Urfa Holocaust. And this image captures the relatives of the people who perished in the cathedral, just days after this horrible tragedy, going back to the cathedral, cleaning it up, the remains of their loved ones, in the church, so that they could go back there for prayers, for baptism, for burials. I mean, just imagine how much power they have to find in themselves for this. Of course, you would say it didn't work out, because of the Armenian genocide, they still have to leave a few decades later. But it allowed for someone like me, a descendant, to be the first person in my family to go back in 2014 and pray during Ramadan. So there was the Islamic prayer, and there I was also praying, the Lord's Prayer in Armenian. So this very interesting interfaith engagement that took place. Not an ideal scenario, not what Armenians would hope for, but at least for a memory to be preserved even for that moment. And so, as we wrap up the service the series on the past of Ottoman and Western Armenia, then I hope I've given you enough material to ask questions about what is it that can be done and must be done to save the future of the past of Western Armenians. Thank you very much.